Neverhome is the story of a woman who disguises herself as a man and goes to fight in the American Civil War. When I was doing my research, over 500 women had been documented fighting for the North, the Union Army, and fighting for the South, the Confederate Army. And they came from all sorts of different circumstances and walks of life. And the research was tremendously interesting, and at a certain point I had to stop reading about it and start writing. So, there's a long tradition in the United States of writing, telling stories about the Civil War, writing novels about them. It's a rich literature. It's been done many times. It wasn't interesting to me to add to the pile of Civil War literature per se. I was interested in the idea of someone going and doing this extraordinary thing, which is to go to war. It's not an experience I've had. I've had many relatives who have had this experience. And on top of that, to do everything that everyone else did, but in disguise. I was strong, and he was not. So it was me who went to war to defend the Republic. I stepped across the border out of Indiana into Ohio. $20, 2 salt pork sandwiches, and I took jerky biscuits. 6 old apples, fresh underthings, and a blanket, too. There was a heat in the air, so I walked in my... Something like 20 years ago, my wife, who's a poet, Eleni Sekelianos, gave me a book of letters that were the Civil War letters home from a soldier to his family. They were signed Lyons Wakeman, most of them. These letters were found in a box in the attic of a family's home. And they didn't recognize the name at first. Who is Lyons Wakeman? But then some of the letters, when they investigated more closely, they realized were signed Sarah. And there had been a Sarah in the family. And as it turned out, Sarah and Lyons were the same person. Sarah went to war and fought under the name Lyons. And so this book that Eleni gave me was this collection of letters that were full of rich details about fighting, and not just going to war, but going to war in disguise, which is much more difficult. And so it was an amazing book to read. I set it aside for 10 years, and then the idea came back to me, and I knew that I had to do something with it. I wrote a book before Neverhome, which centers the story of a woman in a difficult circumstance, who has to push through it, who has to overcome. And that laid the groundwork for me. That novel was called Kind One. It laid the groundwork for me to make this exploration of a character who is in so many ways unlike me. I'm a man writing the story of a woman in the 19th century who does something completely unlike what I've done. But I always took the perspective. I always, in fact, for a while above my computer, I had the line written, write of, but never for. I never imagined that I was speaking for women who had fought in the Civil War, or women generally, or anyone else. But I wanted to evoke their stories. And it seemed to me, in the question, in the context of war, much more interesting after many, many interpretations of Ulysses and Odysseus going to war. Well, what would happen if Odysseus stayed home and Penelope went to war instead? That story interests me because it seems to me that the historical record is full of that kind of gesture. It just hasn't been told. Those songs haven't been sung. And so this was maybe my small attempt to highlight the fact that it hasn't just been men doing things. We all know this, but we still need to say it over and over again. So here's what happened if you were discovered as a woman, dressed as a man in 1863. There were 3 possibilities. 1, you were immediately expelled, 1,000 miles from home, go home, right? That was the simple thing. 2, you were humiliated, and there was the implication that you were crazy, right? So there was humiliation, punishment. You were forced to walk naked through the camp. You were had a barrel hung on you, a sign hung on you that said what you had done, etc. And then the third one was you were accused of being a spy, right? Women were known to have been spies during the war. And possibly you might end up being killed, right, for committing this crime, right? So all of these things were always on your mind, being discovered, in addition to being killed, in addition to getting sick. And it was this that was interesting to me, to do everything that a soldier had to do, and then to conceal who you were to be able to do it. That was the aspect, and whether it was a context of war or some other context was not so important to me. It was really this human effort to simply march forward, to move forward, and to maintain a kind of sense of inner self. And one of the things that this character, Ash Thompson, who's at the heart of the novel, discovers is that sense of the interiority, who she is going to change greatly over the course of the pages of this novel. And it was interesting for me as a writer to go on that journey with her and see to what degree she changed. So if I'm going to write a story as an outsider, as a man, without presumption, but that centers the story of a woman, I'm going to offer all the complexity that I can bring to the table to that character. And maybe it's in that, right? It's one thing to say Penelope goes to war, but who is Penelope, right? What we know of her from the Odyssey is someone who stays home and weaves and unweaves, right? She does this. That's her gesture. But what about what is inside of her? That's what's interesting to me. It seems to me that's still what fiction can offer, that television can't offer, that movies can't offer. It can offer a deep look at the interiority. I like to think of the gesture of spelunking, going down deep into a cave, right, by ropes with lanterns on, and trying to understand, trying to comprehend what it is to be a human being. And it seems to me that if we can find a way to answer that question, it doesn't matter if that human being lived 300 years ago or 15 years from now. The answers will be similar. The greater questions will be the same. And maybe that's why this story still has resonance. It's about someone who does something extraordinary, but does it with the tools of all of our shared humanity. And that's what I aspire to capture. There was an old lady outside Kettering fetched me up a drink of water from her well, took a long look at me as she handed it to me and told me I needed to watch my step. No one else outside the lady saw what I was. I slept just exactly like a pine plank on that walk. I sent Bartholomew my first letter from Dayton. I sent him about the same one from Cincinnati. I wrote that I missed him fierce. I wrote that I was fierce happy, too. Neverhome comes from a poem that a fellow student of mine, when I was studying writing many years ago, wrote. Let's see if I can remember the poem. Very short. Then death the end of nothing takes, when fear, when ash, when oranges, beneath a yellow moon, the Neverhome arrives just briefly, then is far again. So that's the first time I saw that one word, Neverhome, right? So there's no space in between. And it was a kind of place. It was a kind of state of mind. It was a kind of sense of being. And so it's almost its own entity. It's almost a proper name. And so for me, it made sense. It's a kind of condition, a mental state. It's a word that doesn't really exist outside of the context of the novel. So it made a kind of sense to keep it as the title. It's almost like putting a place name, as if you were going to put Paris or Athens, Neverhome, Berlin, on the title of the book. And I was also encouraged in this because my translator, Χρήστου Οικονόμου, felt very strongly that it should stay the title as well.